Welcome to this Developer Essential series. We are going to talk about the web application development through Java platform today. Welcome every one of you. It's going to be a very short video which will give some insights about the new people who are going to start on the web application development. And at a very high level, we are going to cover some of the topics, some basics of web application, and then we are going to talk about little more details on the coding aspect in the traditional approach versus a pattern called MVC, a design pattern, and why is it important for web application development. And also we're going to touch the bits of code in a Java platform, how it is being segregated into multiple layers as part of MVC. And last but not least, we're going to also touch base on the servers which are available in the open market, basically the developer options to deploy this application into that server. And that's pretty much what we are going to do today. Before we dive deeper into that, I would like to talk about a little bit on the development, right? Any application development, whether it's a web application, enterprise application, even learning something new on a standalone Java application or any other application, we need to have three things ready before even we talk about it, right? One is the development. How are we going to do development? Primarily the integrated development environment like Eclipse or IntelliJ. Primarily there are 4-5 wonderful IDE tools available in the market, and then the build tools. How are we going to deploy this and build this application after we do a development, and how are we going to deploy it in the server, right? What kind of server we're going to use for deployment before we start it, right? As part of deployment, we're also going to talk about the packaging, how to do the packaging, and then after the packaging is done, how we do the deployment, how we start up the application. These are all the basic things which as a developer everyone is expected to know. And also the framework we're going to talk about is MVC, right? Without further ado, we can jump into the presentation. Okay, so every developer who wanted to learn something as part of web application development should ideally know some of the basics. When we say basics, since we're talking about the Java platform, we should know what is a servlet. Servlet is the basic entry point for any developers to start on any web application development role. So servlet is an enterprise package API, part of Jakarta EE. Earlier it used to be a Java EE API framework, and that basically converts a Java application into a servlet based application, right? It's simply extending a HTTP servlet class, and then by doing that class, we should override the two methods primarily, the do get and do post. The do get is a method which is required if you're going to invoke from the browser for any of the web pages, the servlet, basically through the URL, right? See, each of the requests will go through the URL only, but then any additional parameters if you wanted to pass on to the servlet, ideally will be passed as part of the URL after the question mark. Something this way, okay? When we talk about the URL, so since we are going to first start development in our local host, this would be the URL ideally. Like this. So this is the get format. Basically, if you look at this in a get request, will go this way. How does a post request goes? Post request goes usually with the same URL, but then it won't have this additional parameter. But then the values of a name and other things will be passed on. So this will be the get request and this will be the post request. In post request, ideally the values will be passed as a form submission, and so that will be sent to the server and web server will take care of it. So as part of any web application, it will be handled using a HTTP servlet request and HTTP servlet response. These are the two different objects which will contain the request related parameters and then the response related parameters. Okay, when I say request related parameters, things like headers, cookies, cookie informations, and then timeout informations and additional parameters. So that way inside the program we will be using the request.get parameter, and then similarly for HTTP servlet response, which used to send the response back to the user, to the basically the client, the web browser, right? And that output will be a simple text, or it can be an output PDF file, or it can be anything, right? A web page with a complex further input fields and other things, which in itself would obviously help the user to navigate to other pages after submission. So these are the two primary objects, or the class that every developer should know as part of web application development using Servlet and Java. Now coming back to views, what is a view? View is basically a page, right? When we say page, it's what it is, a HTML page basically, that what gets printed or displayed in the web browser, right? It can be a complex HTML page, or it can be a simple page. It can handle even in a mobile web browser, it will just simply display according to the viewport, right? Size of the page and things like that. So in Java world, it is a JSP page. JSP is a technology which is a scripting language which helps the developers to write the web pages. Okay, it's nothing but an enhanced version of the HTML with additional scriptlets and other tags and other action tags, things like that. This particular video, the scope of JSP we are not going to include, and we are going to simply talk about the web application development in general. So with that said, web.xml is another important artifact, configuration artifact, a part of the application. Now talking about this web application will be packaged into a file called WAR, which is a WAR file, Web Application Archive. That's the expansion for that abbreviation. Web Application Archive is a file format which will get deployed into the web server, right? So as part of the web archive, the WAR file, the whole Java code will be there, servlet will be there, views will be there, and web.xml is a key entry point for the web application archive. With that said, the configurations of servlets and what are all the list of servlets that it's going to invoke when the user invokes basically any URL from the browser, and what would be the output of the servlet, and what would be the mappings, URL mapping after the servlet gets executed. And also it talks about a lot of other artifacts, filters, listeners, things like that. We're not going to go into the details, but we're going to give a high level overview of this for people who are aspiring to get into the web application development using Java. Okay. And scope is another Java object, part of JSP as well as a HTTP servlet. There are primarily two scopes. One is a session scope, another one is an application scope. Session scope is something where the user logs in to a particular application, and then throughout the session until he logs out, it will be maintained as a session per user, right? So that is handled by a HTTP session object. An application scope is handled by a servlet context, is another class, but that talks about some of the values that are accessible across the users, but within the application will be handled by the servlet context. And then we also have something important thing developers should know is a dispatcher. Dispatcher is something after execution of a particular servlet or a JSP page, what is the the response to be routed to. Okay, and the dispatcher Java class can be an interceptor to do something prior to forwarding the output response to another page or another servlet chain. Okay. And this is how going to be the web.xml sample, web.xml. In later versions of this application development using Spring Boot, web.xml will usually be replaced by annotations and auto configurations. But originally the web.xml will come in this form. It contains a lot of tags, XML tags, which is based on a specific schema called a web app schema, right? As part of the Java EE Enterprise Edition. And if you see, ideally that application should have a display name and then one or more servlets, and each servlet carries a name, and then what is the equivalent class with the path, the package path, and also any initialization parameter that has to be passed as part of the servlet, right? And if you closely pay attention, we'll also see something. Excuse me, I just went back. So if you also note this, we will see the servlet mapping, which is basically the what is the output of servlet and where it has to route it to, right? All these will be handled with a servlet mapping. You can have multiple servlet mapping for a single servlet. And similarly, welcome file list is something, the moment a web server is up, what is the welcome page that has to be displayed as part of this application has to be configured there, right? And error pages are something, whenever the error happens during execution of the application, what error code comes, and accordingly we will route it to the corresponding JSP page will be configured here. Nevertheless, to mention, these are not the limited set of the tags that are being part of web.xml. We also have a lot of exhaustive lists like MIME mapping, which we would cover basically whether it's a text HTML or application/PDF. And then we also have the login config and then realms for the security roles. And additionally, we also handle the filter and filter mapping, and listeners, everything will be part of this, right? To just give a high level view of this WebXML. Okay, now we are going to talk about the common issues that a developer will face when part of development and deployment for the web application using Java platform. So the common issue is the session timeout. So basically, if the session is not configured properly for the timing when it has to be timed out and things like that, then it will do timeout either earlier than what is expected, or it will take a long time to do the session timeout, right, for each user as part of the application. So that has to be handled properly. And the few other issues are cross-site scripting and null pointer exceptions, which usually come for any of the Java objects being created and not used. This specifically in the context of the web application, whenever the attributes or parameters which are expected to come as part of the URL or the form submission, if it is missing or user is not keying in, if it is not a mandatory field or set up somewhere in the UI page, obviously the null pointer exception will throw as part of the execution of the servlet, right? Now, how does the web application development happens in a traditional application? Traditional application development happens usually all the logics, business logic, and all the database connections and everything, including the view like HTML pages, scripts and codes, all put together in a single page and a single file, right? It's hard to maintain, but then that's very simple for any development of a small application, right? It is good, but if you're going to develop a full-blown web application, obviously this poses a lot of problems to the developers, especially maintainability of the code is really going to be costly, and then people will get lost whenever they do any enhancements with that, right? And also the team collaboration is going to be a tough job if they are going to work as a team for developing such a web application, and the timeline will obviously get impacted for this. Now, that requires something called a MEC architecture, which is nothing but a model, view, and controller. This is basically a separation of concern. Instead of having everything into a single file, we'll just dissect it, or probably split it into multiple layers. Like model is mainly for handling some of the database entities, views for the HTML and other output, and controller is for action handling, things like that, right? What happens with this MVC architecture is it clearly demarcates this layer and helps the team to work in parallel, and then there is going to be a less maintenance issue for the code point of view, and it is going to be faster in development as well. So that is something we need to keep in mind, why we need to be avoid traditional web application development. Okay, this is just an example we're trying to show how it is going to be if we are going to develop in a monolithic architecture, which is a traditional application. In this example, we have shown something on a PHP file. If you look at this PHP file, we also have something, the database connection being introduced inside the PHP tag, and the results are getting from a particular query called select asterisk from users, and we also have the view, basically the HTML here, and some of the looping and other constructs specific to the business logic is also being handled. So this is what I have earlier told you, that this monolithic or traditional approach, though it's easy to develop in a short number of files and other things, it is going to be really maintainability wise, it's going to be a really difficult task. That's something we need to be very much aware of while we're doing the development. So what is the solution for this? As I said earlier, MVC is the approach. How do we do the MVC? So basically a database entity objects will be a Java object. So here we are not showing it in a PHP, we are showing it in Java. And so this is a model, which is an entity which contains all the primary keys and other things. And if you look at the repository, which is nothing but a DAO layer, right, which is also part of controller's logic. Controller can in turn get again divided into multiple layers, right? DAO is one of the layer, but model, view and controller. Model is M, view is something will come back again, which is a JSP page, and controller is basically a servlet, right, as an entry point. But then internally a servlet calls another service class calls a DAO layer class, DAO layer calls the database, and things like that. So yeah, here is the controller, right, which handles the request, incoming request, basically whether it is it's usually annotated with the controller object, and then we'll say a get mapping or a post mapping, and then we'll say what it is going to do, users. Now if you, in this case we are showing a time leaf template as a part of the view, which primarily go with HTML tags mostly, and then with a few additional scripts and other things. Instead we can also go with a complete JSP. Here the EL and other way of implementing the objects like a user and other things from the server side, we will be able to do it that way. Now talking about the controller, we also have this application that can be boot using a Spring Boot. This is another option. Little advanced concept that every developer should be aware of. And this is a comparative view of a PHP monolithic and then the Spring MVC equivalent. Spring MVC is a framework which introduces all this MVC pattern with a very well-defined set of Java classes for dispatcher, filters, and the controllers, right? And here is just a snapshot of the options of servers that are available for the developers. Tomcat is the widely used web server for development purposes, which is a free of Apache 2 license, and which supports the servlet in JSP, right? And also an embedded option is available if you're going to develop using Spring Boot. And Jetty is another web server, the same like Tomcat, okay? That is also a free license for development, and then for production it has to be paid version of it. And other options such as Wildfly and WebLogic, Glassfish and WebSphere that are from different companies, but WebLogic and WebSphere are completely commercial. Even if you develop something, you have to host it in you have to have a commercial license to run it actually. So these are all different options for the developers when you're trying to do a deployment, okay? Okay, and what is the MVC framework we spoke about, right? So, how is the MVC framework supported? MVC is being talked about widely in the development environment and ecosystem. Spring MVC is a very well known framework which helps largely the developers to simplify the boilerplate code and then focus only on the business logics and the view components, right? And JSF also has been there for a long time, similar to Struts. Struts was originally developed as a MVC framework, and it evolved over as Struts 2.0, and then it also evolves with a lot of tags and custom tags being built out of the market and things like that. So Java Server Faces is also one such thing. And recently we've been, Vardin has been there for quite some time, around 3-4 years in the market. And Play and Grails are other options that the user can consider as well. So now we talk about this MVC framework, and there were some questions from some of my developer community where why not Angular or React.js considered to be a MVC framework? But it's in fact it is not a MVC. It's a purely Angular is a MVVM, which is a model view model kind of an architecture. It's not fully a controller based, whereas RxJS can be used for controller kind of a thing. But then mostly it is a development from a UI point of view. And similarly for React.js, we'll talk more about the React.js in probably a different, video. But this React.js is something, it's a purely a view based application that we can develop, right? And that's all, folks. Thank you for joining. And stay tuned, we will add more content with more detailed developers view in upcoming sessions. Thank you.